And we are all set.
Okay. Well, hello everyone and good evening. I am Dr. Elaine Renfret and I'm an associate professor in the social work department here at Edinburgh University. And on behalf of the sponsors of tonight's event, who are the Edinburgh University's President's Commissions on LGBTQIA+, the Diversity and the Women's Issues Commissions, and the University Foundation, I want to welcome all of you to this presentation entitled The Intersection of Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and Transgender Communities. And I am going to briefly introduce you to tonight's speaker, who is Dr. Tj Jurian. He is an independent scholar, consultant, trainer, and advocate, and he has spoken and consulted at hundreds of college campuses, conferences, and community-based organizations. His scholarship, facilitation, and advocacy center on trans and queer people of color, color's experiences, perspective, and leadership, with particular attention to masculinity, transness, and racialization, campus gender and sexuality centers and practitioners, and transing constructs and methodologies. Dr. Jurian has over 30 publications in books and journals across many disciplines, including gender and sexuality, student affairs, social work, and trans studies. You might also know him from when he appeared in the award-winning docuseries Transgeneration in 2005. Through sharing stories, histories, and current realities, TJ will attempt to lay some groundwork to think about the intersections of gender and race, with a particular focus on trans people of color, and reflect on how we want to be involved and contribute to leaderful movement. Whether you're new to the conversation or an old hat, there's something to be gleaned for everyone. So without further delay, I turn the evening over to Dr. Jurian.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Renfret, and the commissions for inviting me to be a part of your evening here today. I'm really excited to get into this discussion and to share a little bit of my story, but especially to talk about what intersectional gender justice is, what transformative movements mean, what leaderful means, and how you can be a part of that if that is something that you want to. And also, my gratitude to any and all groups at Edinburgh who've helped make this event possible. I want to start with acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the occupied territories of the Gabrielino or Tongva peoples, who are the traditional caretakers of Tavangar, today known as Los Angeles, California, and that I reside on part of the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, today known as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. As a settler, as an immigrant, and as a descendant of genocide survivors, I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to the ancestors, the elders, and the relations, past, present, and emerging, and recognize the histories of land theft, of violence, of erasure, and oppression that has brought so many of us here today. For those of you who would also like to acknowledge the original caretakers of the lands wherever you might be, a useful online resource that you can use is native-land.ca. And there you can input your location, find out about territories, languages, and treaties, and also learn what land acknowledgements are and why they're important to make. For me, land acknowledgements are really essential, but they're pretty insufficient in terms of being part of queer and trans liberation work, of really doing any sort of intersectional gender justice work. But it is a bare minimum. It's important that we remember that binary concepts of gender and sexuality, as well as ideologies like heteronormativity and cisnormativity, did not exist here before colonization, and that the gender binary was violently enforced and was part of the cultural genocide that was enacted onto indigenous people on these lands, including through residential schools and other educational institutions. And also, gender and sexual diversity is not something new, but actually was a historical reality here. And so this work of doing gender justice work has to be about decolonizing gender and sexuality and understanding that while some terms and some words and identities might be new, queer, trans, and non-binary people have always been here in some form or another. So language is historically, culturally, and contextually an evolving thing. So I do want to take a quick second to go over some words that I'll be using today, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And also because these words mean different things to different people. And so I want to make sure folks know where I'm coming from when I use them. So the first word that some folks might be learning and getting to be more familiar with is the term cisgender, or cis for short. And this refers to basically anyone who identifies with the gender that aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth, right? The word was created specifically to make these conversations about gender value neutral, right? The prefix cis at the beginning of cisgender comes from Latin, and it means on the same side of, right? So it's just descriptive of our relationship to our sex assigned at birth. Whereas the prefix trans, which is in front of the word transgender, is basically means across, right? So it kind of takes away our tendency to describe cisgender people as being normal, as being traditionally gendered, as biologically gendered, but actually just describe who they are and not assign normativity or non-normativity to different people. And I might also use the word cishet, and that's just a combination, shortened word to describe people who are cisgender and heterosexual. Obviously, I'll be using terms like transgender and trans, and I use these words in a very expansive way, right? I want to include the thousands of ways that gender shows up and that people can show up in and identify as. It can include trans men and trans women, but beyond two-spirit people, boys, trans femmes, genderqueer folks, and a whole host of non-binary people, and on and on and on. And non-binary is a bit of a catch-all term, right? It refers to anyone that doesn't identify with the gender binary, and whether in terms of their gender identity or their gender expression, right? How they appear. And also both, right? Some combination thereof. Non-binary folks are often assumed to be trans, which is the case for many non-binary folks, but there are also many cisgender folks that are also non-binary. So non-binary kind of doesn't sit in either space completely, right? Now, I've already mentioned the gender binary a few times, which is also known as cissexism. It's basically a system of ideas and structures that assume and reinforce a two-gender category system, right? And which is essentialized and based on our sex assigned at birth. It's important to name the binary gender system as a system of oppression because it helps us understand that it's not just about our interpersonal interactions, right? It's not just about treating each other better as human beings, which is definitely a part of it, but it's also much bigger than us, that it's part of structures and policies and implemented through laws and through cultural norms and values, right? So it shows up everywhere. It's beyond just relationships and interactions. And lastly, connected to the gender binary is cisnormativity, which I mentioned earlier. And that's basically the assumption that all people are cisgender. And so we build our worlds and our structures and our systems for cisgender people specifically, because we don't recognize that other folks exist, and then expect everyone to conform to the system already in place. But that's all the Trans 101 y'all are going to get. You didn't come here for a vocabulary lesson. So I also want to say, like, you don't need to know all the words, right? You can learn along the way as we move through this conversation. And also there are plenty of resources online, and I can always come back and do that sort of work with you all more intensively. But the reason I mentioned that you don't actually need to know everything about trans people in our lives is because you can still participate in these discussions. You can think about what it might take to move gender justice forward, what your role is, what your relationship is to trans folks and to gender. And also it allows us to accept the fact that we're going to make mistakes. Mistakes happen, and it's about being able to recover from those mistakes, being able to take being called in without defensiveness, with graciousness, with the gift that was given to us, and be able to move forward, right? No one is helped when we sit with our guilt when it comes to privilege or whatever sort of identity we're being called in on about. But I actually want to share a little bit more about me so that you know, something about the lenses and the perspectives that inform what I come with, right? How I show up. And specifically, I want to share about a moment that radically shifted how I understand my own gender, and particularly my transness, my masculinity, and my race, as well as what it means to do justice and liberation work as a whole. That moment occurred about 4 years ago, and when I had the opportunity to attend a 4-day leadership retreat that was held in Oakland, California, and was held by the Bromboy Project. The Bromboy Project is a community of mostly queer, gender diverse, masculine of center people of color, all of whom are committed to changing how our communities talk about gender in one way or another. At the time, I was 31, but that was the first time in my life that I felt like a whole person, where I felt all of me come together and allowed to sort of coexist in one space. It wasn't in a collegiate context, right? It was in a community context. And by that point, I was a doctoral student. I had been in higher education for 8 years as a student and for 5 years as a student affairs practitioner, and that experience had not shown up in those contexts. And even since, right, I haven't experienced that feeling of wholeness. I share this story to sort of overview the 3 main ideas that I want to share with you today. The first is the concept and practice of transformative leaderful movements, why that's important and how you can choose to be a part of it, because the Bromboy Project was an example of that for me. The second is that central to doing transformative and leaderful anything is intersectionality. So this is what has to be the grounding of movement work, but it will also be the grounding of this talk. And finally, in terms of what my masculinity and transness have to do with any of that, basically the short answer is, and I'll sort of show up as I speak, is that those 2 things are core to how I experience gender, and thus they inform my approach, they inform my priorities, they help me answer questions like, who do I feel accountable to, right? And it's my invitation for you all to also reflect on your own understandings and experiences of gender, so you can really reflect on how you specifically connect to all of this, right? Where do you come in? What do you bring to the work and the conversation? Who are you accountable to, right? Accountability in particular really informs how we move in this world. So let me start by breaking down what intersectionality is and where it comes from. Some folks might be familiar with this quote from Audre Lorde that says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives," right? That quote captures the essence of intersectionality, right? This idea and the reality that because none of us are only one thing at a time, we also do not experience different contexts as only that one thing, right? It emphasizes the different dimensions of life that cannot be separated out, right, into these really discrete, pure strands. My identity and experiences as a man cannot be separated from my identity and experiences as a trans person any more than either of them can be separated from my identity and experiences as a Middle Eastern person or an able-bodied person, and so on, right? I am none of those things one at a time, right? I am their complex, interweaved compilation all of the time, and with varying enactments of privilege and marginalization, which also shift depending on the context. Now, that second part is really, really critical, and it's often the part about intersectionality that is either misunderstood or outright ignored, but without which we're not actually talking about intersectionality, right? Intersectionality isn't just about the fact that we have multiple identities, right? Which is true, but it's also, and more importantly, about the systems of oppression that are connected to those identities, and that those systems are interlinked themselves, right? So how I come to experience trans oppression, for example, is markedly different than how a white trans person experiences it, or how a disabled trans person experiences it, how a trans woman experiences it, and so on and so forth, right? Our experiences of transness are not the same, and our experiences of trans oppression are not the same. My masculinity, my able-bodiedness, my being light-skinned, my gender conformity, all of these things insulate me in different ways, right? And while I still experience trans and queer oppression and racism and xenophobia, I don't experience ableism or anti-Blackness, and I don't experience misogyny and sexism anymore. So those systems don't pile on to the ones that mitigate my life experiences. So when we're talking about trans populations, it's important to remember that there are many trans populations and communities, and that there is no universal experience of being trans in any context, including on college campuses. And often when we only focus on one facet of the population or take the whole population on average as one aggregated group, inadvertently what we end up doing is prioritizing the most privileged among that population. In this case, it would be trans folks who are white, masculine, Christian, able-bodied, upper class, gender conforming, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I also want to share where the ideas of intersectionality come from. It was actually birthed by the Combahee River Collective in the early 1980s. And this was a group of Black women who experienced marginalization in both the anti-racist civil rights movement and the white feminist women's movement. It's a Black feminist analytical tool. It seeks to name and deconstruct the interlocked systems of oppression. And something else that is really important for us to know and recognize about Black feminist thought is that it has always been anti-essentialist, meaning Black feminists have forever said that there's no universal experience of any one gender, including womanhood, right? This is important for us to know because it means that the basis of Black feminism has always been trans-inclusive. Unlike many strands of past and present white liberal and radical feminisms, Black feminism has always been trans-inclusive, at least conceptually. Later on, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw came through, who's a critical legal scholar, and she built on this idea to coin the term intersectionality, right? And this was initially for the purposes of advocating for Black women in the legal realm. Since then, it's evolved and repurposed to be used in lots of different areas, including higher education, and to include additional systems of oppression like homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, et cetera, and ableism. But we definitely need to know the roots of where it comes from and to utilize it in a way that it was intended to be utilized and not water it down to something overly simplistic like everyone has multiple identities. Intersectionality is important to learn and know about because it's the driving force behind transformative leaderful movements. It's an important framework to hold because it reminds us of a few things. One, that no individual person can do the work of leading everyone to liberation, right? All of us have different needs, different priorities, different experiences, different expectations, right? And so they cannot all be met if we rely on one single central charismatic leader, right? We often sort of in our minds are already conceiving of as a cisgender man. It also reminds us that Black and Indigenous women in particular have always practiced intersectionality, and we need to honor that and not leave out the very people that have brought us this valuable tool. And lastly, it also validates the power of solidarity. Because no one person can lead us to liberation, it helps us to accept the fact that we need each other, that we have to show up for each other, to do justice work in coalitions and collaborations with each other rather than compete for scraps. I think if anything that the pandemic has taught us, it's that exact notion that we need each other and we need to work together to make it through. Some of you may also be familiar with this quote. It says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." This is a quote that is often attributed to Lily Watson, who is a Dangaloo woman from Queensland, Australia. She's an activist, academic, and artist who has actually repeatedly said that this specific quote is a collective belief that was born out of activist groups that she was a part of. So even in terms of thinking about intersectionality and solidarity of movement work and doing leaderful practices, right? She's talking about this one quote saying it doesn't just belong to her. And that's a very leaderful practice. Intersectionality is firmly embedded in the history of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was conceived as a worth-affirming hashtag and molded into a rallying cry to organize by 3 Black women, 2 of whom are queer, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, and triggered by the anger and the sadness that was the result of George Zimmerman's lack of conviction for the murder of Trayvon Martin. The movement is about Trayvon and Mike Brown and Eric Gardner and Tamir Rice and Akai Garley and John Crawford and Freddie Gray, George Floyd, Laquan McDonald, and so many other Black men. But it's not just about them, because Black Lives Matter refers to all Black lives, right? Including those of Renisha McBride, Corinne Gaines, Shelley Frey, Tanisha Anderson, Rakia Boyd, Pearlie Golden, Yvette Smith, Breonna Taylor, Nakia Bryant, Ayanna Jones, Melissa Williams, Alicia Thomas, Chantel Davis, Cherise Francis, Tarika Wilson, Katherine Johnson, and Darnisha Harris. These are but a few of the names among the countless Black girls and women who've been killed by police and vigilantes or imprisoned for defending themselves, who often go unnamed, and why the hashtag Say Her Name began, right? And it's also about the ones that we forget about the most, and that's Black trans women, like Tiana Alexander, Bianca Danks, Dominique Jackson, 50 Bands, Alexis Kimmy Icon Braxton, Diamond Curie Sanders, Dominique Luscious, Jada Peterson, Remy Fennell, and Tiara Banks, who was just killed a week ago today. These are Black trans women who are murdered at alarmingly high rates in this country. In fact, the 10 women that I just named are 10 of the 16 trans people who've been murdered in 2021 so far. Last year, 2020, was the deadliest year on record for trans people, with 45 trans people reported dead in the US, almost entirely Black and brown trans women. And 2021 is already on its way to being a much deadlier year than 2020. These numbers are also actually probably much higher because of the tendency for police and the media, and also some trans people's families, to misgender them, especially trans people who might not have others in their lives who can advocate for them, right? Often the folks who are the most vulnerable to this violence. In the UK, violence against trans people has quadrupled in less than 5 years, a country that is experiencing a radical resurgence of trans misogyny. And I specifically name trans misogyny, right? Because it's trans women and trans feminine people who are the most vulnerable. And they account for 98%, right? So 98, that's almost all of the murders around the world. The vast majority, usually 85% or over, are women of color and or immigrants. And they're young. The average age among our lost trans siblings in 2020 was 31. The youngest was 15, right? She clearly didn't even make it to college. She didn't even get the chance. And we are only talking about murders here. On every metric out there, whether we're talking about unemployment, underemployment, living in poverty, engaging in underground economies like sex work for survival, criminalization, lack of access to competent healthcare and health insurance, lack of access and retention in K-12 and higher education, and so on, you will find that queer and trans populations experience much higher rates than any of those compared to heterosexual and cisgender people, and that among queer and trans populations, when you break it down by race, by immigration status, by disability status, et cetera, you will find stark differences, right? We don't all experience the same oppression. Black trans women like Aisha Love and Cece McDonald were very well aware of their chances to be killed when each of them were attacked, and each ended up injuring or killing their attackers in self-defense. And in doing so, both women spent significant time in jail. Aisha Love and Cece McDonald are just recent examples of a long historical legacy in this country of dehumanizing and dewomanizing Black women, right? Once you do not see Black women as either women or human, then you do not see them as being worthy of self-defense, right? So this is the legacy that Mariam Kaba has called No Selves to Defend. And there's a sign, and there was an exhibition talking about this long history of dewomanizing Black women. Because it's at the intersection of multiple oppressions, right, of sexism, racism, cissexism, classism, that these lives and voices are snuffed out, caged, silenced, criminalized, and assaulted on the daily, that we must approach our work from an intersectional place that especially honors, lifts up, and listens to the collective and mass leadership of Black and brown, queer, trans, and cis women. And it is why I need to acknowledge how my masculinity, how my light-skinned appearance, how my gender conformity, my abledness, and my middle-ish class status protect me and drastically reduce the chances that my name will ever be on the list of names that are read every year on Trans Day of Remembrance in November. It's also why when I share my story, I also need to acknowledge that I'm here because of Black and brown trans women, right? Black and brown trans women like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, Pauline Park, folks who came and started way before I even knew what trans meant, let alone showed up in that space, but also Black and brown badass trans women and trans femmes today, like Raquel Willis, Ashley Diamond, Bambi Salcedo, Jerice Gutierrez, Tourmaline, Cece McDonald herself, who's now a prison justice activist, Lasaya Wade, Zahara Green, Mati Jim, and many, many others. So I owe it to them to show up, right? And showing up doesn't have to mean starting and running a trans advocacy organization or leading marches or anything else that is easily recognizable as activism. For one, Black and brown trans women have been doing that work and ought to be the ones that are at the forefront of marches and organizations. We should be following them, right? And also activism and organizing is just one of the many ways to show up in a leaderful movement, right? That's where the fullness of the movement really comes in. It's knowing that it takes all of us, and it means that it also needs all kinds of skills, all kinds of talent to do this work in lots of different realms. So a leaderful movement is one that problem solves through multiple modes and allows for people to engage with it through their own skills and strengths, right? So this is, for example, the thought and the idea behind cause-based hackathons. Hackathons, which I'm not sure if they still happen, but they were a big thing like 5 years ago. These are events where computer programmers and software developers collaborate intensively for a concentrated period of time to solve a problem through software projects. Right? A great example of a cause-based hackathon is TransHack, which was created by Dr. Courtney Ryan Ziegler. And this was launched as a response to that growing social and economic barriers that are plaguing the trans community, like twice the national rate of unemployment, immeasurable homelessness, and incomes under the poverty line. TransHack aims to shift how trans people live by creating technology that economically empowers, improves access to social services, promotes gender safety and community accountability, while bringing visibility to trans tech innovators and entrepreneurs. And for very similar reasons of creating solutions to these systemic problems through technology, Angelica Ross, who some of you might actually recognize from the series Pose, launched Trans Tech Social Enterprises, which is a creative design company and apprentice program that teaches graphic design and web development skills to trans people with the ultimate goal that they are empowered to be self-employed, making 100% of their income as an independent contractor so that they don't have to contend with either unemployment or workplace harassment and discrimination as a trans person. Now, the arts also hold an important part in the movement. Tony Cade Bambara said, "The role of the revolutionary artist is to make revolution irresistible." So that sentiment is at the very center of the work that Micah Bazant does through the visual arts, right? Micah memorializes past and current trans revolutionaries and cultural workers and creates artwork for free to be used in protests and demonstrations. So art can be part of activism and can be very central to it. Or the spoken word artistry of people like Kayolanda Barrett and Kitian, right? These are folks who are both storytellers who address themes of gender, sexuality, and race, ability, colonialism, love, heartache, right? So again, like spoken word is such a powerful medium to shift culture and make change. Pat Manuel decided to use his fitness expertise from years of professional boxing and his lived experiences as a queer trans person of color to create a queer fitness resource and program to empower queer and trans people to embrace the strength that is in our individual bodies, right? Dismantling the barriers that keep us from physical and mental potential. Self-love, mental and physical well-being, and self-care are all things that are constantly denied to those of us that face the daily fatigue of racism and sexism, right? And the many ways that they intersect and unleash themselves on us. Audre Lorde herself said that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So the work that people like Pat do to arm trans people with self-love and self-care is a radical investment in the movement. So it's this creativity, this innovation, this multimedia-driven engagement is what a leaderful movement looks like. There's no limit in the ways that you can engage and be a part of this broad reconceptualization of activism and advocacy. And this reconceptualization isn't new. So I want to make sure that I also name that. Folks like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer were doing this back in the civil rights movement. It's a lot of what the present iterations of these movements actually are based on. So whether it's through organizing or research and teaching or working in the legal realm or leveraging technology to serve marginalized populations, using your artistic talents or business acumen, always with a lens towards collective liberation, working with and alongside others, not above them or on behalf of them, then you have the skills to offer, right? To the knowledge to share and the knowledge to gain. All of us can be involved in making our worlds better and our communities thriving from our vantage points. And that's also why I asked you all at the beginning to think about your own gendered reality, right? What makes you you? How do you relate to your gender? What lived experiences have informed and shaped your understanding of gender as a whole, as well as your own? Right? All of that is part of what each of us bring into the equation. So it's important to cultivate the sense of self-awareness about what we're carrying in with us. Grace Lee Boggs, who was the subject of the documentary American Revolutionary. You should definitely watch that piece. It's incredible. And she was a part of that documentary because of her 70 plus years of activism. She said the following: "You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it." Similarly, Mariam Kaba, who's a formidable organizer and abolitionist, has these 4 questions that she asks herself every time she's outraged about injustice. Because sometimes we can really get stuck in that outrage of feeling like this huge problem, there's nothing I can do about it except be angry. And anger can be righteous and it can be good and can be a driving force, but it can also hold us back. So these are the 4 questions that she asks herself. What resources exist so I can better educate myself, right? So she mentions resources that exist, right? Not who do I know that I can extract unpaid emotional labor from so that I can learn from their pain and their trauma, right? So it's resources. Second is who's already doing work around this injustice, right? That question takes humility. It takes knowing that just because I just realized that something is a problem doesn't mean no one else knew. And now that now that I do know, it's incumbent upon me to solve this big problem. There are likely decades and decades of work already having been done and being done today, right, to problem solve, that I can support and amplify instead of create a new space and extract resources and people away from existing work. The third question is about being aware of our own capacities, right? Do I have the capacity to offer concrete support and help that the folks already doing the work are asking for? Because burnout is not helpful to anyone, right? Not to ourselves and not to movement work. So if that capacity is not there in this moment, it might mean that this is a better time to keep educating myself and to keep sharing other people's work so that at least others who do have the capacity can join, and that can be my contribution in this moment. And then I can reevaluate whether my capacity has shifted again in the future. And finally, the 4th question is how can I be constructive, right? And part of that is about asking yourself, what can I offer? Can I provide research skills and expertise? Maybe I'm a good writer or a journalist with a platform. Maybe I'm really good with tech and can help maintain websites or contribute to a social media campaign. Or I can cook or have access to food and water that I can bring to marches and demonstrations or to organization meetings, right? All of these are part of the work. And some of you may be hearing about the hundreds, literally hundreds of bills and legislation currently being debated and voted on and passed in more than half the states' legislators in this country that are restricting trans people's access to affirming healthcare, especially for trans youth, and also the ability to play sports. And before jumping in to help or share an opinion about it, it's important that we go to credible sources first, right? That can educate us on what's actually going on and what sort of help and support is needed. These include people like Chase Strangio, Raquel Willis, and Chris Mosier, who've been raising hell to get people to pay attention to these bills for over a year because they knew they were coming. There were hints along the way, and folks are just realizing they're actually happening right now, and several have already passed. Right? It's about kind of following them on social media or engaging with the public work that they're doing to find out what work is being done on these bills, and especially at the local level, right? What are trans people in Arkansas doing about the bills in Arkansas, right? Not what this large national organization who has no connections at all to what's happening locally is saying or doing, but what are the people that are most impacted? What are they doing? What are they saying? Movement work has to be driven by those that are impacted by the injustice itself, right? Otherwise, what we end up risking is perpetuating further erasure and silencing of those very same people, which just, again, it just furthers oppression and maintains it. It kind of gives it a different twist rather than actually dismantling it. And then once you know what is happening and what is needed, then you can ask yourself, how can I contribute in a constructive manner, right? That word specifically, constructive, that cannot be ascertained without the prior questions of understanding what is there, what's happening, what do I know, what do I need to be educated with? And then I can be constructive in my support. So again, I invite you all to think about those questions for yourself. Right? Think about what you personally are passionate about. Maybe it's not gender justice work. That's fine, right? Maybe you're actually passionate about sports. Great, fantastic. How can you infuse the work that others are doing that gets us to gender liberation through sports and through the realms that you're already in, right? Tj Jurian is one of those guys. He's a cis-het white man who loves sports and writes all the time about injustice and justice through the lens of sports. He has a podcast. He writes for The Nation all the time. Just really amazing work. Or your world might be the legal world, right? You might want to be a lawyer, or are a lawyer, or a legal assistant of some sort. There's an organization called the National Lawyers Guild that does amazing justice work in the legal realm. Or media, right? Or K-12 schools, or healthcare, or clean water access, right? Maybe your cause is something completely different. Maybe it's Fight for Five, or the boycott, divest, and sanction movement for justice for Palestinians. Maybe it's making sure that the cafeteria workers and the janitorial staff at your institution are treated with dignity and integrity and make a living wage and are protected from arbitrary firing. Or you're already involved in disability justice work, or you care about gentrification in your area, or environmental justice, or immigration, right? All of this stuff, right? Every single one of these movements and causes are made stronger by infusing an intersectional lens, by operating from a place of solidarity, and by approaching the work from this mode of abundance and joy and healing rather than scarcity and restrictions and more trauma. We are very much in a pivotal moment in the ongoing history of trans liberation. We are all implicated in this moment, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether we are trans or not. If this moment is to have the most optimal outcome for the most people, then we must engage it from a place of intersectionality, from a place that recognizes the historical context of colonialism, that knows that nothing can be done for us without us, and that understands what is at stake for all of us. So I call on everyone who might be here today, including myself, right? I don't call in people for something that I'm not willing to do myself, to make a conscious decision to assess how each of us are implicated in oppression, because that's inevitable. We all are implicated. And how do we align our bodies instead towards justice, right? It's time that we do away with the politics of scarcity and disposability that position marginalized communities against each other, fighting for scraps, ripping apart those of us that exist at the intersections of many communities. It's high time that we employ politics of abundance, the idea that there is more than enough to go around, of gender expansiveness, of connected liberation for everyone. Now, I want to end with one more quote from Grace Lee Boggs, and that is, we are the leaders that we are looking from, right? So what can we do in terms of looking at the mirror, seeing who we are, how we show up, and how we can show up differently, and really be a part of creating and maintaining and sustaining truly intersectional, transformative, leaderful movement for gender justice. So thank you for your time, for your attention. Thank you for the ways that you do show up and contribute to transforming the world we live in. And in whatever forum we're able to, I'd like to invite some discussion. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen in this moment. Dr. Friend, I don't know if there's a way for us to receive some questions or invite folks to jump in.
I think we have to go to Chris LaFerrier for that. And Chris, are you available?
Yes, we don't have comments on the YouTube page because we had previously disabled comments.
Elaine, can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
When you think about the context of Edinburgh University, how do these concepts and ideas sort of land with you? What are some things that were popping up for you about campus?
Put me on the spot, TJ.
I have to.
A couple of reasons that I have been interested in trying to be an ally. I personally know quite a few people who are transgender, and for me, they are some of the brave, I'll just say it, they're some of the bravest people I know, because they have gone from people, like you said, who really have not felt whole. And despite some incredible challenges that they face by the community around them, decided to do what they needed to do to become who they really are. So that was my really first exposure to transgender, the transgender community, and earned incredible respect from me. And then being on campus, there I started to know transgender students, and it has been, from my perspective, a struggle to provide what it seems to me would be adequate support for that group of students. Even the kind of, I don't know, what seems to me like would be simple things, like student rosters, coming out at the beginning of the semester with the student's preferred name. Supposedly that's a big technical problem, but I don't think it should take 3 years to make that happen. And I've had students that I've spoken with who have had very, very nasty things said to them in class by other students that make make them upset, and make me very upset that they had to experience that. So I think we have a long way to go in making our community a safe place for our transgender students and faculty and staff. There are certainly a lot of students who are supportive. A lot of faculty are supportive, but I know that we need work, and so this presentation and inviting you is one of the ways that I'm trying to help people get some ideas about how they can maybe do some of this work. And I was really happy to hear you say you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to start a big, protest march. There are many smaller quote unquote things that you can do that contribute and make a difference if we all did them. So I'm pretty passionate about being an ally, and have a lot of work that I still need to figure out how to do.
Yeah,
I don't know
and
if that
as we all
answers your
do.
question.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate it. I'm actually going to pull from a couple of things that you said. I think I really appreciate what you mentioned about sort of resonating with the bravery that the trans people in your life sort of had to exhibit, right? And so that oftentimes is something that I think about because that was, you know, one of those words that was tossed in my direction sometimes, especially as a college student and kind of trying to figure out how to make the institution I was a student at work for me, right? Instead of me work for the institution. And so I take that experience and that reality and think about how can I be a part of creating a world or an institution or an organization where trans people, or particularly trans people of color, don't have to be brave, right? So that act of bravery is so exhausting, right? It takes so much constant negotiation and renegotiation with yourself of like, can I do this? Is this a space where I want to push back? And do I kind of stay silent and accept things as they are? That constant sort of thinking and planning takes up so much headspace and so much effort that oftentimes it affects our academics, it affects our work, it affects our ability to really show up as the brilliant humans that we are and contribute in the ways that we're meant to, and be a part of the society that is around us. And so when I think about sort of that creating of a world where folks don't have to be brave, reminds me of an article that just came out actually that said that Edinburgh University is kind of getting integrated with California University of Pennsylvania and Clarion University, I believe, right? And thinking about how critical of a moment that is and how a great opportunity that is to really think about how do we make sure that integration actually creates the kind of space that works for trans students and staff and faculty, right? Because now you almost have a chance at this a little bit of a scratch because there's different systems, right? There's different technologies folks use, different platforms, different policies. And so everything has to be sort of renegotiated and figured out what is the common things that we're using, what is the common spaces, the common policies and processes. And so approaching that work from a space of, okay, and how can we make this new unified policy or process or what have you work for trans people, work for disabled people, work for all the folks that oftentimes these systems don't work for, right? It's just this really cool opportunity to get it right this time type of thing. And thinking about sort of the roster piece and all of that, because it's just, it just takes off so much of that burden to have to kind of go from office to office and figure out where can I find the answers that should have been there in the first place so I can just get to class or write my journal article or whatever the case might be, right?
That it's really interesting that you say that because for many of us, the integration is like a big scary monster under the bed, but to see it as an opportunity to do something positive, that's a very nice reframe. And I really will think about that and see what I can do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Those types of changes, those huge institutional changes can be really, really scary. And I think that's another reason to sort of like have an equity lens to it, because oftentimes when structures are kind of unified and the people that lose are the folks that are at the margins already, right? Those are the folks that kind of fall to the wayside first before anyone else. And so if we sort of revisit that frame and undo that mode of being in institutions, we can actually do the opposite and really center the folks that are at the margins, the folks that are in the cafeterias, the folks that are making the least amount of money as is, the folks who are in the community, and really just kind of figure out how do we navigate this in an entirely new way.
So I guess I was thinking as you were talking, you mentioned a couple of resources that you thought were certainly worthwhile. Do you have any other, I agree that it's burdensome and kind of rude, I think, to go to a person who represent, is a member of a kind of marginalized or different, not, white middle class American, and say, well, tell me what it's like to be blah, 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 and expect them to educate me. So I think it's imperative that we don't do that and find other resources to educate ourselves. So I'm wondering if you have, other than the docu-series that you were in, some other resources that you think are like critical that those of us who are here tonight really should know about.
Definitely. I think one really great resource is actually a book that came out fairly recently by Dr. Z. Nicolazzo, and that's Trans in College. And it's this amazing text that is based on our dissertation work of trans students in a Midwestern school. And really through sort of their eyes, Dr. Nicolazzo exposes everybody to how trans students experience an institution and the decisions that they make throughout the day and the structures that sort of maintain those barriers for them. And so I think that is a very good starter book in particular of like really getting the big picture of trans student experiences in college. Dr. Eric Pitcher has written kind of also a book on trans faculty experiences. So that would be another text to look at in terms of what faculty are experiencing. There isn't a whole lot on trans staff, and that's a lot of there's a big gap there in terms of finding things about and written by trans staff. But beyond sort of the college setting, I think when I think about resources, I think about the things that trans folks create, right? So what are trans people writing? There's so many biographies out there that tell the trans story from lots of different directions. It's really important to kind of see, okay, am I reading the same story over and over again when I hear trans stories? Are there different ones? So can I look for other versions of the story? YouTube is this wealth of stories, because that was a space, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, where trans folks found each other and were spaces where we shared advice, we shared community, we talked about our experiences doing different things, whether that was transition or was managing and navigating relationships. So there's a wealth of just in-person storytelling on YouTube. And actually, Dr. Nicolazzo is coming out with a book about that fairly soon. And also media, right? Media that trans people create. There's a documentary that came out I think possibly about a year ago called Disclosure. It's a fantastic piece that has lots of trans folks who are in the media industry currently talking about the history of trans representation in the media and how terrible it's been, and all the reasons that it's terrible, and all the reasons that it's created and maintained a hostile environment and a hostile world for trans folks. And by being able to see the problem in that representation, they also offer alternatives. A lot of the folks who are in there, like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox and Jen Richards, are creating media themselves and saying, here's our story from our mouths. And these are the things we care about and how we want to share with the world, right? I remember of an interview that Carmen Carrera was doing on TV, and where the journalist asked her, I think it was Katie Couric, asked her to talk about her body and about surgery and about transition. And she said, that is not what I want to talk about, right? Because there's this tendency to always really focus on that narrative, in particular for trans folks, and which is a tiny, tiny part of the trans story, and for many people, not a part of their story at all. So it's such a not central piece of our experiences. So those are I think the resources that I think of right off the top of my head, and they're good places to start, because then they sort of feed into others, whether it's starting with a book and then looking, okay, here's some citations and references that I can dig more into, or looking at things that are in the media and thinking, okay, cool, Angelica Ross was in Pose. What else was she in, right? She's been in a number of different pieces lately. So what else can I watch and learn more about?
Excellent, thank you. That's a really good start, and a variety of media So depending on what kind of a learner you are or what media you prefer, it's great.
Definitely. And I also think of like non-trans folks, right? So cis folks who are doing the work well, and are able to talk about it and work with other cis people to do the work well, whether it's in person or through their works. For example, one of the things I was thinking about is Charlene Carruthers, who is the founder of the Black Youth Project 100. She herself is not trans, but the work that she does is trans-inclusive work. So the organizing that she's done through the Black Youth Project and through other avenues has always included Black trans people in the work. And there's lots of Black trans folks that are involved in BYP. And so the book that she came out with recently called Unapologetic shares in a very, very accessible, non-academic way what a Black queer feminist lens looks like in practice. Which is really, really cool. And it was such a good book. It was one of those things that, just one sitting and I went through it. Just really, really cool text to look at too.
And I'm sorry, say it again. Who was the, I believe you, athlete?
Chris
who has the
Mosier?
podcast?
I'm sorry, can you say the last part again?
I think you said he had a podcast.
Oh, Dave Zirin. I don't know if Dave's ever been an athlete, but he's definitely been a huge sports person. He's also not trans himself, but he's definitely included trans narratives in the work that he's done. I remember when he brought Kai Ullams, who was the first known trans person in a college basketball team, on a women's team. And his story was really out there for a while. And so Dave brought him in to be able to share that story more widely because of the platform that he had. And so he has a podcast. I'm completely blanking on the name, but luckily since we're online, I can very, very quickly look for that. And he's also on Twitter under Edge of Sports. And I think actually that's what his podcast is also called, is Edge of Sports. And he wrote this text. The thing that he's most famous for is written the People's History of Sports, right? So kind of similar to the People's History of the United States, he's written the People's History of Sports.
Well, I really want to thank you for being willing to do this presentation for us. I think that we have had this is the third year that I've tried to do some education for the community around this topic, and I think each year we have had some deeper, I guess maybe is the word, dive into the topic and the resources, and certainly tonight about the sophistication of how to think about it. Is the intersectionality, I think, of how to think about it and why that's important. And that we all have that or those components, and to think of trans people as just one, that's the only thing about them, is certainly missing the boat by a mile. So that this has that your presentation tonight has really helped, I hope, helped us be more sophisticated in our thinking and given us a lot to think about, and also a variety of ways to think about how we can be useful in our efforts to be allies and to further bump along, I guess, the changes that need to be made. So I really thank you for being willing to spend your time with us tonight.
Thank you so much for the invitation again, and for having me be a little part of the story of Edinburgh doing this work, and hopefully get an opportunity to come to campus and meet folks and get more involved in doing this work with you all.
That would be fabulous. Yes. Maybe we should talk about that.
That'd be great.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So, Chris, what do we do now?
I will end the live